Extravagant generosity is one of the values of our congregation. It's something that we practice and something to which we aspire. Generosity stands at the heart of the gospel message. When you look at Jesus Christ, there we find one who gives everything in order that we might live. Generosity works its way into almost every other aspect of Christian life. It is generosity of spirit that allows us to have compassion and share ourselves with others. It is generosity of spirit that allows us to have hospitality and welcome others into our midst. Generosity is part of what the gospel is all about. So every year we take some time to have an emphasis where we re-examine ourselves, where we look inside and we look around the world to see what it means to be generous people of God. This generosity emphasis this year has the theme of a generous undertaking. Now that phrase is taken from 2 Corinthians in the 8th and 9th chapter, where Paul writes to the Corinthians to encourage them to be generous with an offering that they promised. Paul teaches richly and deeply about a generous heart in these particular passages, and we're going to spend some time over the next few weeks looking at what Paul teaches us about generosity. Today, what I'd like to ask you to do as we take this journey and begin together is to pray. Is to pray about what it means to be a generous person, what it means to be involved with others in the congregation in a generous undertaking for the sake of the world and for the sake of one another. I would like you to pray about how you've been blessed to be a person of God, how the abundance of life has touched you, and how you might respond to God's love. Today, I call upon you to pray so that we can consider this generous undertaking that God has given us together. The generous undertaking to which Paul refers in the 8th and 9th chapter of 2 Corinthians is a relief effort that is intended to show God's love for people who are starving. The church in Jerusalem is suffering. This is the church of the apostles, the church that came to be first after the resurrection of Jesus, the church where Pentecost took place. They are suffering first because there is a famine in the land, and the people don't have enough to eat. Paul has seen their suffering, and Paul wants to help. The people are also suffering because there is tension between the Romans and the synagogue and the church as the church continues to grow in the wake of Jesus' resurrection and Pentecost coming. There's also tension in that church over the acceptance of the Gentiles. Even though the book of Acts tells us that Paul and Peter have made up a plan for Paul to deliver the gospel to the Gentiles, and that the leaders are okay with that, there's still suspicion that Gentiles can somehow be faithful Christians without being Jews first. Paul hits upon an idea, and that idea is famine relief. Paul's generous undertaking is an offering to alleviate first the suffering of the saints in Jerusalem by providing food, but also by sharing God's love in a way that establishes mutual love between the faithful. Even though the Gentiles that are going to contribute offerings to the saints in Jerusalem are far across the sea, they will be bound by Christ's love and the power of the Holy Spirit, and Paul knows that that will witness to the fact that including the Gentiles is precisely what Christ had in mind when he came to be Messiah of all the nations. Corinth is one of the first congregations that Paul establishes in his missionary work. Corinth is an important city, a lively, affluent, and well-placed city in the Roman Empire. It sits on a narrow isthmus of land that makes it important for navigation. In this map of Greece, you might think that the easiest way to navigate from east to west and west to east is to go down around Peloponnese and continue from the Aegean into the greater Mediterranean Ocean. That's a lot of miles and some dangerous coastland, however. In an age when GPS and nautical and navigational tools were not available, where you navigated mostly by dead reckoning and staying close to the coast, it was much safer and saved a lot of time if you could find shorter distances. And so Corinth became a place where trade took place. If you navigated from Rome, for instance, you came into the Gulf of Corinth and you docked at Corinth, which sits right there. This little narrow band of land, the city had placed tracks so that ships could be picked up on one side of the city and easily transported to the other side and dumped in the ocean to continue their journey eastward. Same way if they came from east to west. Both sides of the city had ports, and that made it an important place. So important that when Rome had destroyed Corinth as it conquered Greece, it learned quickly that it had to rebuild Corinth because of the importance of its location. Ancient Corinth, because of all the trade that went through and because of its importance to the empire, was a very wealthy and affluent place. The people there took advantage of all the trade that came through the city. They had jobs, they had things to do. It wasn't a hard scrabble living of agricultural societies. It was a city that thrived. Everybody was able to find a job and to eat. They were educated. In the classic tradition of Greece, they taught their children well, and the people of Corinth were thus educated. They were important to the empire, which meant that Roman troops guarded the city and took care of making sure that enemies did not have any threat that they could pose to the city of Corinth. They were a crossroad of commerce, so products were available at the end of your fingertips. It may not have been as convenient as Amazon or some other internet experience, but the market was not far away. They were not experiencing a famine at the time that Paul establishes an effort to relieve the famine in Jerusalem. In fact, the vineyards were fruitful and the fields were full. Paul had asked the Corinthians to take part in his generous undertaking of relieving the famine in Jerusalem when he was there the last time. Then he had left to go into other parts of Greece and establish churches, leaving Titus, his companion, behind to kind of be pastor of the church and their leader. One day, Titus shows up where he's not supposed to be, not in Corinth, and tells Paul that the offering that they had promised, the offering that they had assured him would be bigger than anybody else's offering, has never happened. It's not materialized. And so Paul will be embarrassed and disappointed if he goes back to Corinth. Titus wants to hang out with Paul. Paul has other ideas, however, and so he pens these 2 chapters of 2 Corinthians in the 8th and 9th chapter and sends Titus back to finish the work that was started. He says that we might urge Titus that as he has already made a beginning, so he should also complete this generous undertaking among you. Then Paul challenges them. He says, now as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in utmost eagerness, and in our love for you, not to mention your affluence and your education and all of the goods in your markets, so we want you to excel also in this generous undertaking. You do everything else well. Don't be cheap. Like the Corinthians, we also excel in many things. We have blessed lives in our community. We may have the struggle of pandemic and violence in the world, but our tables are not empty for the most part. Like the Corinthians, we are called to a generous undertaking that will minister to the needs of the community and the world as we share God's love. through all of our actions, our service, and through our giving. Sharing our offerings with ministries throughout the community and around the world is one of the ways that our generous undertaking takes shape. It is our mission. Sharing our building with the community and using it to establish a presence in our community is an important part of our generous undertaking as we maintain it and repair it and keep it up to date and usable for those community groups. Feeding the hungry here and around the world through our food pantry, the Love Lunch program, the World Hunger Appeal, and countless other ministries like Free Store and Family Promise and LSI are ways in which our generous undertaking is our mission. As we pass on the faith to our young members as they grow up and learn how to love God, to love neighbor, and to love creation, as we worship as a community, even when the pandemic strikes, we are taking our generous undertaking to new levels. It is our mission. The list goes on. Through our mission partners, pastoral care to those in need, fellowship and support groups, learning opportunities, and many other things, our generous undertaking, our mission to share God's love, is supported by our offerings. Our generous undertaking is to support a vital ministry that makes Christ present today and tomorrow and on into the future. In this first video, we invite you to pray and to think about joining this generous undertaking with renewed commitments of support or new commitments of support. You can find more information about giving to the congregation on our website. Please join us in this generous undertaking.